Today we're going to be working on part 2 of the color wheel assignment, where we're going to be mixing the neutral colors that will be filled in the middle of the pure hues that we painted on the outer ring in the first part. So the materials you need for today are your completed outer hues of the color wheel, a brush to fill in the paint in the center, palette knife, cup of water, paper towel, your palette paper, and the same 6 colors of paint that you used the last time. So you're going to have your 2 reds, 2 yellows, and 2 blues. I'm going to walk you through the mixing of a couple of the complementary colors to make the neutral chromatic grays in the color wheel, and then after that I will speed up the process so you can see what it will look like at the completion. So I'm going to start out with the violet and yellow complements, and we're going to mix grays in the center that are going to meet in the middle at the most neutral gray we can possibly make. So it won't look the same as when you mix black and white together. It will be what we call a chromatic gray, meaning that it's gray made out of colors. So we're going to make as close to an achromatic gray as we possibly can with what we're given. So we're gonna start by remixing the first 2 colors. So I'm gonna mix yellow and I'm gonna mix violet in the same way I did last time. Yellow I'm gonna mix using cadmium lemon and brilliant yellow. And I would set it up on your palette paper the same way I am for maximum efficiency. And you wanna use a fair amount of paint this time around because you're gonna use the same colors to mix the grays throughout this process. So there are my 2 yellows. Now to make violet, I use ultramarine blue, and rose Tyrian. So this is a good opportunity if I wasn't happy with either of the original hues that I mixed to correct them, or if they're too transparent to put a second layer down. So I was pretty happy with mine, so I'm just going to try to match the color. So yellow is going to contain both of these. Mix it until it approximates that perfect yellow again. And you want to have a nice pile of paint here with the consistency of very soft peanut butter, perhaps. Maybe a consistency more of like hand lotion, I might say. Okay, that looks pretty good. Now for the violet. Again, don't be afraid of using too much paint because you're going to need this quantity to mix the grays that are going to exist in between. Okay, step 1, I want to mix the chromatic gray that exists between violet and yellow. And that is going to be these 2 colors mixed together. So 2 colors here, 2 here, so it'll be 4 total when I mix the center gray. That gray is not going to be painted onto this wheel because we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 slots to fill, which means there's no exact center, right? There's 3 on one side and 3 on the other. And this again is going to be a little bit subjective. It's mostly just when the color doesn't feel more violet or more yellow. So I'm going to take small bits at a time. And again, it's not going to be 50% of this and 50% of that. I'm going to have to figure out how much of each. So that's why I'm starting out with small amounts. Right now that feels more yellow than violet, right? So I feel like I need a little more violet. More yellow or more violet? Seems almost in the middle, maybe a little, feels a little more yellow, so I'm just gonna add a tiny bit more violet. Okay, I'm pretty happy with this. So obviously it's not gray. If I had to call it a color, I would say maybe more towards brown, but it's the most neutral color that I can get with this combination. Now I'm not painting that on there because it belongs right in the center. The next thing I'm going to do is mix this one with the yellow in small quantities and with the violet in small quantities to get an incremental step that goes from violet all the way to yellow. So the easiest way to do that is to find the next set of middles. Okay, so if this fell right in the center, I then can find the center between this color and violet, and I can find the center between this color and yellow. So I'm going to take a little bit of this. This is why you want to mix up a good quantity, because you're going to keep using this neutral. I'm going to mix a little bit of that with yellow until this color doesn't feel more gray or more yellow. Right now it feels a little more yellow, add a little more gray. Okay, I think that works pretty well. So I will take this color and fill it in here. Now it's very tempting to want to just kind of go in order instead of doing this center average approach, but you will have a greater degree of success if you do it this way without having to repaint it. So I strongly recommend that you follow this, and if you mix up enough paint, then you won't have to try to touch it up later. And these areas are a little smaller than the ones in the outer ring, so you need a little bit less paint. There's yellow. So now I can do the step that goes in between this medium neutral and again the yellow, and I can do the one that goes in between this neutral and the gray. So I'm going to try to get all the paint out of here I can, so even squeeze it out of my brush. Now I'm going to do this one, so halfway in between here and yellow. I always find this one's really hard because it's very easy to make this yellow more neutral, so I'm going to start with more yellow and add little bits of this color to it. Okay, and then when I'm happy with that, and now I'm going to do the last step in between yellow and the middle neutral gray. So in between these two, probably going to need all of that. So let's And if you need to use a different brush, you can always switch it up. For these smaller little pie pieces. Okay, so there's yellow to the center, and then I'm going to do the same thing on this violet side, going from violet to the center, and I'm going to speed this one up a little bit so that I can move on to the next color and explain again. Now I'm working from my same neutral to violet. In the same process, I'm going to mix the center between violet and this gray. Chromatic Gray. Now after I've filled these in, I want to check and make sure that they are as opaque as possible while maintaining the consistency of the color, and that I want to make sure that the steps feel like they're even going towards the center. So you'll see that on the violet side they're a little darker, on the yellow side they're a little lighter, so it's a little bit harder to see the difference between some of these colors, but because yellow is so much lighter than violet inherently, there's going to be a gradation from light to dark in addition to from saturated to unsaturated in the center. So that's what you want to feel within each pair as you move around the color wheel. I showed you this one first because it's very clear that there is the value gradation and then also the hue gradation, again from saturated to unsaturated. It's not going to be exactly that way for some of the other pairs, so as I move on to the next one, I'm going to show you a pair that has two values that are closer to each other to begin with so that you can see what happens in the center. I try to keep my selections of colors that I'm mixing separate as I go along. Sometimes if I run out of a color, I'll have to dip into another and I won't be able to save that little area. But in general, I try to, because then if I see that one is drying a little bit too transparent or it's not even enough, I can go back and do another layer on it while I have the color still wet. So I don't think this one is quite opaque enough, and luckily I have the color right here so I can go back and do a second layer on it. Just like that. So I would prioritize the color mixing over the, I guess, paint quality or opacity on this final sheet. But as long as you mix up enough paint as you go along, you shouldn't run into a situation where it's way too transparent. But the whole thing will feel much nicer and be more consistent and have clearer steps if you keep the paint a little bit more opaque, or as opaque as you possibly can. Now I'm going to do another set of complementary colors that have closer values to begin with so that you can see what happens as you mix the neutrals. And I'm going to give myself a fresh cup of water. And a fresh palette so that I have enough space to mix up the full range in one place. Okay, I'm gonna do, let's see, I think I'll do red to green for the next one, because those two I think are fairly close in value to start out with. So again, to mix red, mix my two reds together. Rose Tyrian is one, cadmium, no sorry, flame red is the other. And then my green is going to be made with turquoise blue, and cadmium lemon. Same process as before. Mix these two reds together until they form the best ideal red that I can find, a primary red. I want to match it to what I already have. Again, I can do another layer on that one if it needs it. Looks pretty good. And then mix my green. Great, now I'm gonna mix the neutral, the chromatic gray, by, again, finding the center of these by mixing little bits together until I find a neutral that doesn't feel more green or more red. You can see again it's making sort of a brown, definitely very neutral color. Okay, does that feel more red or more green? I think it's pretty close, maybe feels a little more red to me. Add a tiny bit more green. I'm actually just gonna add a little bit more quantity of each so that I can have more to work with. All right, I think that's about as neutral as I'm gonna get. Now, that color represents the center, which I'm not painting. I'm using that to mix the other colors. So then I'm gonna go ahead and find the color in between the neutral and the red for this spot, and the color in between the neutral and the green for that spot. I'll start with the one on the green side. Just a couple of quick observations while I'm waiting for this to dry so I can see if it's correct. The colors dry a lot darker, so when I'm painting them on wet, I was worried that this one was a little bit too green, that it wasn't neutral enough, but as it dries, you can see it's already getting a lot darker, and you'll see when it's totally dry that it's gonna be much darker, and the same goes for that one. So when you're looking at them wet, it's easier to compare than comparing it to the dry color. So trust what you've been mixing over here, wait until it dries and look at it before you analyze whether you need to change it or not. Now I'm gonna go ahead and do the red side by finding the halfway point between my pure red and my middle chromatic gray. Okay, now a couple of tips while we're waiting for that to dry. While you're working on this, if you run out of your center neutral, your chromatic gray, I recommend that you just go ahead and mix more of it so that you can continue on instead of trying to continuously thin out the little bits you have left and trying to build up the opacity, because ultimately you will have greater success if you have enough paint. Another thing is that as you're going through each one of these colors, if you realize that you need to change something or touch something up, I would essentially start over. So mix your two saturated colors again, your pure hues on the outside, and then mix the middle neutral, and then mix the middle. So continue going through that process. It's really tempting to just like take this green, for example, and add a tiny bit of red to it and then continue on in that way. But if you keep finding the centers, you're more guaranteed to have success the first time around instead of trying to remix or rematch something by kind of taking a shortcut. And you're gonna end up having a lot more layers and having to then continue repairing more and more colors if you do it that way. So I really recommend following my path of finding the center and the center and the center, continuing to find those averages. You're gonna know that it's right the first time instead of having to continuously like touch it up, change it, etc. So now that these are starting to dry, you can see with red and green, what happens is that as the colors move more towards the neutral in the center, they start to get darker. So with the first set, the violet and yellow, they went from the lightest value all the way to the darkest value. With red and green, they start with the lightest values and then they get darker as they move towards the center. So when you fill in the entire center, it's not going to have the same pattern of light and dark across each pair of complementary colors. Each one's going to have an individualized relationship. So when we're completely finished with this wheel, what we're going to have is a reference basically of how to mix almost any neutral that you could ever want. So this is incredibly valuable if you are trying to match colors. This basically will give you a guide. So if you were looking at something you saw in nature and you wanted to match the color, you could refer to this color wheel that you've completed and say, I need a warm gray, or I need a cool gray, and you could look around through here and see which colors you would need to mix to make that. So I'm going to go ahead and mix the rest of the colors and fill in this wheel, but I'm going to speed up the video so that you can see what the final product will look like and follow me through the process a little bit, but it'll go by a little bit faster. So I'm going to move on to the next set of complements and go forward from there. And then at the end, I'm going to have a bit more of an analysis and explanation of what I've completed. So make sure that you listen to the dialogue at the end of the video. So next I'm going to mix red, violet, and yellow, green. Okay, final analysis before I turn this in. I want to look at the wheel as a whole and check for a few things. First, is there any white space showing in between any of the sections? I want to make sure that there are no white lines or white spaces in between. So I have a couple here. My wheel is definitely not perfect, as I was rushing through it and didn't really do any second layers on any of the colors. So I have a couple dots, not a big deal. Next, I want to look at the opacity of each one of the color areas. Are there any that feel like they have too much water and the white space coming through or the white paper coming through is distracting from seeing the color that should exist in that space? I would say a couple of my innermost corners there could use another layer. There's a couple other spots where the pigments were especially transparent that I could have used another layer. Next, are there any colors that feel out of place? So one that jumps out to me in mine is there's kind of a green looking triangle right here on the blue to orange complementary relationship. I think because that feels so green, it probably belongs more on the blue side than the orange side. So I believe that either my central neutral wasn't neutral enough, it was too blue, or else just this one that I mixed should have had a little bit more orange in it. That's the type of thing that you want to look at before you are finished. So don't really bother with worrying about the relationships between the colors and the ones next to them, because each set of complements has an individualized relationship with itself. So that's what you really want to analyze. So looking at each complementary gradation from one neutral or from one pure hue to the other towards the neutral center, those are the relationships that you want to be strong, and each one is going to have an individualized relationship that is different from the ones next to it. So it's not as though you're going to have a consistent value that goes around each circle. It's going to be a little bit jumpy in that way, but you don't want anything to really, really stand out to you as being out of place. In that case, there probably is something that you could have changed about the mixture. Another one of mine that kind of jumps out, there's a very orange looking triangle in this center between red, violet, and yellow, green. So perhaps that one needed a bit more green in order to belong on the green side of the wheel, as opposed to the warmer red violet side. So those are ones that I might want to go back into, and I generally find that as long as you're being really careful as you go through each section, so each set of colors, then you don't have to go back at the end and try to like mix just that one tiny little triangle or something like that. So just go through it really methodically. Make sure you have enough time. This is a time-consuming project, but it's one that you will come back to use this again, as I mentioned earlier, as kind of a color reference. So if you do a really good job, it'll be helpful in future projects, and you'll get used to the handling of the paint as you use this. As you use it in this project, you'll figure out how to control the opacity, how to mix it, how to use your palette knife, how to use your brushes, all of that. So you might end up with like some extraneous marks. I have an extra little orange mark. I dripped some water on it at some point here. Do your best to keep it neat. But again, accidents happen, and you might end up with a couple of marks that you didn't intend to be there, but that's totally fine. Just be as neat as you can with it and focus mostly on the color mixing. And then when you're satisfied with it, that's when you can photograph and submit the assignment.